In the years after independence, India worried about many things: borders, unity, identity. But there was one fear that lived quietly beneath them all: hunger. Not the passing hunger of a missed meal, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles into villages, weakens bodies, and turns survival into a daily calculation. In the early 1960s, India was still largely an agricultural nation. Most people lived close to the land. Seasons mattered more than speeches. Rainfall mattered more than ideology. And when the rains failed, everything else followed. At night, in cities and towns, people slept unaware that the country's food security rested on fragile assumptions, that grain stocks were thinner than they appeared, that ships arriving from across oceans carried not just wheat, but reassurance. India produced food, but not enough. Population growth was relentless. Yields were low. Farming depended heavily on the monsoon, and the monsoon was never predictable. For a while, imports filled the gap. Large shipments of wheat arrived under a program called PL 480, supplied by the United States. The grain was affordable. The arrangement seemed practical, but it came with an unspoken cost: dependence. Every sack of imported grain carried a quiet question. What if it stopped coming? At first, few believed it would. India was non-aligned, democratic, peaceful. Why would food ever be used as leverage? But history is rarely so kind. By the mid-1960s, clouds gathered, both literal and political. The monsoon of 1965 was weak. Fields cracked, crops withered early, harvests shrank. Then the monsoon of 1966 failed again. This time, there was no ambiguity. The land was dry. Wells sank lower. Farmers watched the sky with a patience that slowly turned into fear. Food prices rose. Grain reserves dwindled. The government began to calculate numbers it had hoped never to see. How many months of wheat remained? Which states were most vulnerable? What would happen if the ships were delayed? At the same time, India's relationship with its food suppliers was changing. The United States, preoccupied with its own global priorities, was less willing to supply unconditional aid. Grain shipments became slower. Approvals took longer. Some weeks, ships waited offshore, not because grain did not exist, but because decisions had not yet been made. In villages, the consequences arrived quietly. Meals became smaller, proteins disappeared first. Children grew thinner, people did not riot. They endured. India had known hunger before. Colonial famines were not distant memories. Older generations remembered years when entire regions starved, while grain was exported elsewhere. That memory returned now, not as panic, but as resolve. Inside the government, a realization hardened. A country that cannot feed itself is not sovereign. Military strength means little if food supply depends on permission. Economic plans mean little if drought can erase progress. India did not just face a food shortage. It faced a reckoning. In Delhi, discussions stretched late into the night. Scientists were consulted. Agricultural economists spoke bluntly. Farmers' realities were finally allowed into policy rooms. One truth stood out clearly. Traditional farming methods could not support India's population growth. Even in good years, yields were too low. India did not need incremental improvement, it needed transformation. But transformation carried risk. New ideas always do. Among the proposals was something radical: high-yield variety seeds. These seeds promised far more grain per acre. but they demanded more water, fertilizer, and careful management. They would work best in specific regions. They would favor farmers who could adapt quickly. Critics raised concerns. What if the crops failed? What if farmers rejected them? What if dependence simply shifted from foreign grain to foreign technology? But hesitation itself carried danger. Doing nothing meant watching hunger deepen. At the center of this debate was a man who rarely spoke loudly. M.S. Swaminathan. An agricultural scientist with a quiet intensity, Swaminathan believed that food security was not charity, it was dignity. He had studied genetics and plant breeding. He understood that the right seed, placed in the right soil, could change history. But he also understood farmers. Change could not be forced. It had to be proven. India's leadership, now under Indira Gandhi, made a decision that would shape the nation's future. They would take the risk. Not nationwide, not recklessly, but decisively. Punjab and Haryana became the testing grounds. Irrigation infrastructure already existed there. Farmers were relatively receptive. Conditions were right for controlled experimentation. The Green Revolution did not begin with celebration. It began with doubt. Farmers examined unfamiliar seeds. Fertilizer usage increased costs. Water demand rose. Some worried they were gambling with their livelihoods. But the crops grew, and they grew differently. Taller stalks, heavier grain heads, fields that looked fuller than anyone remembered. Harvest season arrived, and with it, disbelief. Yields surged, grain stores filled. For the first time in years, the numbers began to turn. India was still importing food, but less urgently. The psychological shift was as important as the physical one. For the first time, India could imagine feeding itself, not someday. Soon. This change did not erase hardship overnight. There were side effects. Regional inequalities, environmental costs that would be debated decades later. But in that moment, one thing mattered more than anything else. People were eating, children were gaining weight, markets stabilized, panic receded. India moved from desperation to determination. Indira Gandhi would later say that the nation must bet on the stomach of the people. It was not rhetoric, it was survival strategy. The success of the Green Revolution did something subtle but powerful. It restored confidence. A country that had feared famine began to believe in its own capability. Grain silos replaced anxiety. Food aid turned into buffer stocks. Dependence slowly gave way to self-reliance. This shift affected more than agriculture. It changed how India saw itself. If food could be solved through science and policy, what else could be? Energy, industry, technology. The lesson was clear. Sovereignty begins with essentials. The late 1960s closed with a different mood than they had opened. India was still poor, still unequal, still struggling in many ways, but it was no longer on the edge of hunger. And that mattered more than most people realized. Years later, when historians looked back, they would often focus on wars, treaties, and political upheavals. But those who lived through the food crisis remembered something else. The quiet fear of empty plates, the relief of full harvests, the realization that dignity could grow from soil. India's near famine did not end with a dramatic announcement. It ended with meals eaten quietly in homes across the country, with granaries filling slowly, with farmers trusting the land again. It ended not with applause, but with sustenance, and sometimes that is the most important victory of all.